The receipt was about the size of a man's palm. Crumpled, folded, it had been tucked into a jeans pocket on a warm Wednesday morning in May, the back covered in hurried pencil marks that barely held together as a sentence. Being followed. Please help. This man is a bad man. That sentence survived 45 years. The woman who wrote it did not. Hideko Akashi was 43 years old. She was a mother, a neighbor, and the kind of woman who volunteered to organize the school fundraiser 2 years running because no one else would step up. On the morning of May 23, 1979, she walked out of the Izumiya supermarket, where she worked her part-time shift, tucked a lunchbox under her arm, and headed into the bamboo hills behind her city to pick wild ferns with a friend. She was never going to make it home for dinner. But before she died, she did something remarkable. She found a crumpled store receipt in her pocket, took a pencil, and wrote down a cry for help that no one would find until it was far too late. She identified the threat. She named him as a single man. She gave investigators every piece of information they needed, except who he was. That question would take 45 years and a breakthrough in forensic science to finally answer. And when the answer came, the name it attached to that receipt would change everything the people of Nagaokakyo thought they knew about a man who had lived quietly among them, and then vanished from their world entirely. But to understand what happened on that hill in the spring of 1979, you first have to understand who Hideko Akashi was. Nagaokakyo sits between Kyoto and Osaka, old enough to have temple names carved into its hillsides, new enough in 1979 to feel like it was still growing into itself. The small city had bloomed fast during Japan's post-war economic expansion, and by the late 1970s, it was the kind of place where the same families ran the same shops their parents had run, where neighbors knew which bicycle belonged to whom, and where you could walk to the vegetable market and come home having spoken to 8 people you recognized by name. It was a community built on small rhythms. The hiss of morning radio from open kitchen windows, the smell of miso broth drifting across narrow lanes, the station wagon sound of the bread truck making its Thursday rounds. Life was returning to something that felt like ease after the hard years of the oil crisis. Japan in 1979 was a country finding its footing, and in a city like Nagaokakyo, that optimism had a daily, domestic texture. People felt, more or less, that their neighbors could be trusted, that familiar paths were safe ones, that knowing the faces around you meant something. Hideko Akashi had lived in that trust her entire adult life. She worked the morning shift at the Izumiya supermarket, the busy anchor store clustered around Nagaokaten Station, because the hours let her be home before her children finished school. She was 43 that spring, not young, not old, settled into a life she had built carefully and tended without complaint. Her co-workers remembered her as someone who kept track of everybody's birthday. Her neighbors remembered her as the one who always had an umbrella to lend. Her husband would say later, in an interview that took him a long time to give, that the house without her was like a room without windows. Keiko Mizuno was a decade younger, 32, with a son barely old enough for nursery school. She had taken the part-time job at the Izumiya to help with household expenses, and had become close with Hideko in the unspoken camaraderie that forms between people who share a routine. The morning routines of small talk and shift handoffs, and knowing glances across the produce aisle. The two women were comfortable together the way people become when they have put in the quiet work of actually paying attention to each other. On the morning of May 23, 1979, the warmest day of the week, 28 degrees by mid-morning, the kind of spring day that arrives like an apology for the weeks of rain before it, they had a plan. After the morning shift ended around 10 o'clock, they bought their lunch boxes at the supermarket, packed them into backpacks alongside bottles of cold barley tea, and climbed onto their bicycles. They were heading to the hills behind the city. The locals called it Noyama, a gentle name for a ridge that wasn't quite a mountain. A bamboo-covered slope rising to 230 meters where families came on weekends to gather ferns and bamboo shoots and sit on the rocks in the shade. Hideko had been up there 7 times already that spring. It was her territory. She knew the paths. For Keiko, it was her first time. They locked their bikes near the Jacoin Temple, just below the trailhead, and walked into the trees. It was shortly after 11 in the morning. At 3:30 that afternoon, Keiko was supposed to pick up her son from nursery school. She never arrived. That was the last ordinary moment. After that, nothing about this case would ever be ordinary again. When Keiko didn't arrive at the nursery, the staff called her home. No answer. By evening, her husband had traced her steps to the Izumiya, confirmed with co-workers that she had left with Hideko after the shift, and driven the roads between the store and the hills looking for 2 bicycles parked somewhere. He found nothing. The Nagokakyo police were notified that evening. By the following morning, May 24, the search had expanded. 50 officers, 50 volunteers from the local fire brigade, police dogs, every trail on the western ridge being walked in a coordinated grid. Nothing. May 25. The second morning. A search team working the upper trails above the Jacan approach pushed through a stand of dense bamboo and stopped. The 2 women were there, less than 3 kilometers from their homes. The scene told a story without requiring explanation. Keiko Mizuno's backpack was beside her, untouched. Her empty lunchbox was there. A kitchen knife, not hers, had been driven into her left chest. Her lower clothing had been removed. Hideko Akashi was 10 meters away. She had been beaten with savage force. 9 broken ribs, a ruptured liver, more than 30 distinct bruising wounds across her body. She had been strangled. Her backpack sat beside her. The wallet was inside. The money was there. Not a single yen had been taken. The killer had not come for money. Detective Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Kyoto Prefectural Police, the lead investigator on the case, would note in his report that the scene suggested both extreme violence and methodical attention to evidence removal. The knife had been wiped clean of fingerprints and left behind. The killer had searched the area around the bodies for anything he might have dropped. He had taken the pencil. He had not taken the money, or the backpacks, or anything else that might indicate a material motive. He had overlooked a pocket. In the right front pocket of Hideko's jeans, folded once and crumpled against itself, investigators found a supermarket receipt from the Izumiya. The date on it was May 21, 2 days before the murders. On the back, in hurried pencil marks that pressed hard enough to nearly tear the paper, someone had written 7 words in Japanese. Being followed. Please help. This man is a bad man. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was Hideko's. The investigator's reconstruction was this. She had grabbed the receipt from her own pocket while the attacker was occupied with Keiko. She had written the message in the moments before she too was attacked. She had folded the paper back and tucked it away. Then she was killed. The pencil tip was found 17 meters away in the undergrowth, broken from the pencil at the lead, as though snapped in a struggle. The pencil itself was never recovered. The killer had taken it. He had taken everything he could think to take. He had missed the crumpled paper in a dead woman's pocket. Detective Tanaka had spent 12 years in Kyoto Prefectural Police before he caught this case. He would later say it was the one that never let him go. Within days of the discovery, The investigation had expanded to a scale unusual even for a double homicide. More than 200 individuals from the surrounding area were interviewed and checked for alibis. A composite sketch was developed from a witness who reported seeing a suspicious man in his 40s near the Jacoin Temple around midday on May 23, heavyset, in dark work clothes, moving quickly toward the ridge. The sketch was published. Tips came in. None of them held. The blood evidence gave investigators one clear fact. The perpetrator was blood type O. In 1979, that was significant. It narrowed the pool, but not conclusive. Blood type O is the most common type in Japan. It fit half the men in the city. Early in the investigation, a man in his late 40s who lived near the trailhead drew intense suspicion. He had a history of neighborhood disputes, gave inconsistent accounts of his movements on the afternoon of May 23, and could not produce a verifiable alibi for the midday hours. Detective Tanaka's team pursued him for the better part of 3 months. But the physical evidence, when cross-referenced carefully, failed to match in ways that could not be explained away. By autumn of 1979, he had been eliminated. Meanwhile, the families of the two women were navigating their own impossible situation. Keiko Mizuno's husband had done things in the weeks after the murder that struck observers as strange, made certain financial transactions, began keeping different company, stopped attending the family support gatherings that had organized themselves around the case. Police interviewed him multiple times. He cooperated, formally, each time. Nothing pointed directly at him, and he was never charged. Hideko Akashi's husband, by contrast, donated the full amount of his wife's life insurance payout to the Kyoto Prefectural Police Cold Case Investigative Fund. That gesture was noted, and it was never forgotten by the officers who worked the case. The families formed a committee. They pressed for annual updates. They wrote letters to the police superintendent. The investigation remained formally active. 207 individuals in total were eventually interviewed or eliminated, but every lead arrived at the same walls. In 1984, 5 years after the murders, a third woman connected to the case was found dead in her home in Nagaokakyo. She had worked at the same Izumiya supermarket as Hideko and Keiko. She had, according to sources close to the investigation, been on the hill that May morning with the other two women, but had turned back early and returned home before anything happened. Now she had been stabbed and her home set on fire. The Kyoto Prefectural Police investigated the connection. They never publicly confirmed it. Her name was never released. The case remained officially separate. By the end of the decade, every practical lead had gone quiet. By 1989, 10 years had passed. The Izumiya supermarket had been remodeled twice. The Jacoin Temple had installed new gates along the approach path. The bamboo on the upper ridge of Noyama had been thinned for a housing development, new families with small children, none of whom knew what had happened above them in the spring of 1979. Detective Tanaka had been transferred to a different department. He kept a single photocopy of the receipt evidence photograph tucked into the inner cover of his personal notebook, folded the same way the real receipt had been folded in Hideko's pocket. He showed it to a new colleague in 1991 and said simply, "She told us who it was. She just couldn't tell us the name." By 1992, a national magazine ran a retrospective. Elderly residents of the neighborhood were quoted. One said she still didn't walk past the temple alone after dark. Another said she hoped whoever did it had never stopped thinking about what he did on that hill, not for a single day of the years that followed. May 24, 1994, 15 years after the murders. Under Japanese law at the time, the statute of limitations for homicide had now expired. The case was officially closed. No prosecution could ever be brought. The bereaved family's committee gathered on that date. Hideko Akashi's son, now in his late 20s, attended. Keiko Mizuno's son, who had been waiting at a nursery school on May 23, 1979, for a mother who never came, was in his early 20s now. He had grown up knowing the shape of what happened, but not the who. He had grown up understanding that the justice system had drawn a line in the sand and declared it sufficient. It was not sufficient. The faded reward notice that had hung in the window of a local soba restaurant for years was eventually taken down. The neighborhood had moved forward. The families never could. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verified facts, and the effort to restore real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to what happened next. The case had been cold for nearly 30 years when a retired forensic analyst named Fumiko Oshiro took a second look at an evidence box that had been sitting quietly in a Kyoto storage facility. Fumiko Oshiro had spent most of her career in forensic document analysis for the Kyoto Prefectural Police. When she retired in 2016, she accepted an advisory role with a cold case review committee that had been quietly organized to apply modern technologies to evidence preserved in the decades before those technologies existed. The Nagokakyo file came to her in the spring of 2022. What caught her attention was not the case itself, she knew it, as most people in her field did, but a single line in the evidence inventory. The Izumiya receipt had been stored in an acid-free evidence bag since 1979. It had been subjected only to handwriting examination. It had never been touched by any technology that didn't exist in the Showa era. She submitted a formal request. The process she proposed, microscopic touch DNA recovery, works by extracting genetic material from trace amounts of skin cells deposited on a surface through ordinary contact. Not blood, not saliva. Touch, the cells transferred to paper when a hand presses down. In plain language, if the killer had ever handled that receipt, whether he had passed it across a counter, or grabbed it from Hideko's pocket to see what she had written, or simply touched it in the struggle, he might have left something behind. The request was approved in 2023. The receipt was transferred to the Kyoto University Forensic Sciences Laboratory, where a team led by Dr. Kenji Mori spent the better part of 8 months working to recover usable genetic material from a surface that was 44 years old, crumpled, repeatedly folded, and, because of the evidence preservation protocols of 1979, only partially protected from environmental degradation. On a Thursday morning in November 2023, the laboratory generated a partial DNA profile from the receipt. Incomplete, the decades had left gaps in the sequence. But it was enough to work with. The profile was uploaded to Japan's National DNA database. For 4 months, it produced no match. Then, in March 2024, the system flagged a familial connection. Not a direct hit, a partial overlap with a sample that had been submitted 3 years earlier during an unrelated investigation in Osaka. The sample belonged to a nephew. Investigators approached him. He cooperated without hesitation once they explained what case they were working and why his Na had appeared in their search. He answered their questions. The trail ran backward through 1 generation. His uncle, his father's older brother, had emigrated to Brazil in 1981, 2 years after the murders. He had returned to Japan twice, once in 1993, once in 2006. He had died in São Paulo in 2017 at the age of 83. The investigators had a name: Detective Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka had been retired for 11 years by the time two cold case officers knocked on his door in April 2024 to tell him what the DINA had found. He sat quietly for a moment after they finished speaking. Then he asked them to show him the laboratory report. He read it twice. He set it on the kitchen table and did not say anything for a long time. His name was Tetsuo Kurosawa. He had been 45 years old in May of 1979. He had lived in Nagokakyo for 7 years before the murders, working as a day laborer and occasional delivery driver for commercial suppliers in the industrial district south of the city. He was, by every account that could be gathered, largely unremarkable. Quiet, kept to himself, no criminal record on file. He left no impression on the neighborhood strong enough for anyone to remember later, which turned out to be, investigators noted, not an accident. He had been interviewed once during the original investigation, in August of 1979, as part of the broad sweep of men in the area who could not account for their midday hours on May 23. He told police he had been working in Osaka that day. The officer assigned to his interview noted a discrepancy. The job site could not fully verify his presence for the afternoon hours, but the discrepancy didn't rise above the ordinary noise of a large investigation, and the interview was closed without follow-up. His blood type was O. He left Japan in 1981. He told the few neighbors who noticed that he had family in Brazil. This was not untrue. He sent a postcard or two in the years immediately following. Then contact stopped entirely. The composite sketch published in newspapers in 1979, a heavy-set man in his 40s, dark work clothes, seen moving quickly near the Jacoin Temple approach on the morning of May 23, matched Kurosawa in several particulars. His former supervisor, interviewed in 2024 at the age of 91, looked at a photograph of Kurosawa from 1978 and sat very still for a moment before saying that it looked like it could be him. Yes, he said he hadn't thought about Tetsuo Kurosawa in decades. He said he wasn't sure he had ever thought about him very much even then. Kurosawa's nephew described an uncle he had met only a handful of times during childhood visits to Japan. A silent, solitary figure who brought candy for the children and did not stay long. He had never mentioned Nagokakyo. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, ever mentioned the spring of 1979 to anyone. The DINA profile recovered from the Izumiya receipt was matched against Kurosawa's reconstructed genetic profile, assembled from the nephew's sample and validated through family genealogical records, at a probability that the Kyoto University Laboratory described as confirming identity beyond any scientifically reasonable doubt. The Kyoto Prefectural Police held a press conference in June 2024. They named Tetsuo Kurosawa publicly as the man responsible for the murders of Hideko Akashi and Keiko Mizuno on May 23, 1979. They acknowledged clearly that no prosecution would ever be possible. The statute of limitations had expired 30 years before, and Kurosawa himself had been dead for 7 years. The room was quiet when the superintendent finished speaking. At the back of the room, Keiko Mizuno's son stood near the wall. He had driven from Osaka that morning. He was in his late 40s now, older than his mother had ever been. Someone handed him a photograph, the Izumiya receipt, inside a protective sleeve, the pencil marks still legible after 45 years. He folded the photograph carefully. He put it in his pocket. There is a photograph of Hideko Akashi from a few weeks before her death, not from the investigation files, but from a school event she attended in early May of 1979. She is standing in sunlight at the edge of a schoolyard, caught laughing at something off camera, wearing the kind of expression that doesn't know it's being photographed. She looks like herself. That is the photograph her son brought to the press conference in June 2024. He was not told about the DNA results before the announcement. He was told the morning of, over a quiet meal with the two investigators who had worked the cold case review. By the time lunch was finished, he knew the name Tetsuo Kurosawa. He knew that his mother, in the last minutes or seconds available to her, had found a scrap of paper in her pocket and written down the most important thing she could think to say. He knew that she had been right, one man, a bad one, and that she had pressed it into her pocket and tried to survive, and that the paper had done what she could not. "She told you," he said. "She told you from the beginning." Keiko Mizuno's son made no public statement. He had his answer. He went home. What this case demonstrates, and what every investigator who worked it across 45 years understood in different ways, is the strange arithmetic of justice when it collides with time. The 1979 Statute of Limitations was not a law designed for cruelty. It was a framework built before anyone understood that paper could hold a person's DNA for half a century, before science could reach into a crumpled receipt and pull out an identity. In 2010, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for murder entirely. In part because of cases exactly like this one, because families like Hideko Akashi's and Keiko Mizuno's had spent decades pressing the government to close a door that the law had been leaving open to killers. Tetsuo Kurosawa lived 38 years after the morning on Noyama Hill. He was never suspected. He was never questioned again. He left Japan and built another life on the far side of the world, and he died in it, and whatever he carried with him from that May morning in 1979, he carried to the end. Hideko Akashi wrote 7 words. She survived, in the only way that remained open to her, as the woman who kept her composure long enough, under conditions no one should ever face, to reach toward whoever might still be listening. After 45 years, someone was. What do you think justice looks like when the guilty man is already gone? When the truth arrives too late for punishment, but not too late to be known? Does naming him change something real for the families who waited decades for an answer? And what does it say about what we owe the dead, that an ordinary supermarket receipt outlasted the man who tried to leave no trace at all? Justice found Hideko Akashi and Keiko Mizuno 45 years after they were taken from the hills above their city. Stories like theirs are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.